So basically, my entire life exploded in front of 120 people because of one text message. I was standing there in my tux, checking my phone one last time before walking down the aisle, when I saw it. My bride had just canceled our wedding via text message an hour before the ceremony. Not a call, not face-to-face, just a cold message saying she couldn't go through with it. I stood there staring at my phone while guests were already arriving and taking their seats. My best man was asking if I was ready. My parents were beaming with pride, and her family was bustling around making final preparations. Meanwhile, I'm holding this nuclear bomb in my hands wondering what the hell just happened. The crazy part is that exposing the truth in front of everyone actually saved me from the biggest mistake of my life. So I'm Daniel, 29, accountant. I work at a mid-sized firm downtown doing corporate taxes and financial planning. Pretty boring stuff, but it pays well, and I'm good with numbers. I've always been the responsible type, you know? The guy who plans everything out, saves money, follows the rules. My coworkers always joke that I was the most organized person they knew. I met Sarah 3 years ago through mutual friends at a barbecue. She was charming, outgoing, everything I thought I wasn't. We started dating, and things moved pretty fast. She was always pushing for the next step, moving in together, getting engaged, planning the wedding. I went along with it because she seemed so sure about everything, and honestly, I thought that's what you're supposed to do at 29. The wedding planning was intense. Sarah took control of everything, which I was grateful for at the time. She picked the venue, the flowers, the menu, even my groomsmen's ties. I just wrote the checks and showed up when she told me to. Looking back, I should have paid more attention to how she never really asked what I wanted. She'd present me with decisions she'd already made, and I'd just nod and agree. My friends at work kept asking if I was excited, and I always said yes. But deep down I felt this weird anxiety I couldn't explain. I figured it was just normal pre-wedding nerves. Everyone gets cold feet, right? I convinced myself that marriage was supposed to feel scary and that Sarah's confidence would balance out my doubts. Man, was I wrong about everything. The morning of the wedding started off perfectly normal, which makes everything that happened even more surreal. I woke up in my childhood bedroom at my parents' house, where I'd been staying the night before following some old tradition Sarah insisted on. My mom had already made coffee and was bustling around the kitchen, talking about how proud she was and how beautiful the day was going to be. I felt surprisingly calm as I got dressed in my tux. The anxiety from the past few weeks had settled into this weird acceptance. Today was the day, and after months of planning and thousands of dollars spent, we were finally going to do this thing. I kept telling myself that once we got through the ceremony, everything would feel right. My best man Jake picked me up around 10 to head to the venue. The place looked amazing. Sarah had really outdone herself with the decorations. White flowers everywhere, elegant lighting, the whole 9 yards. The staff was setting up chairs in perfect rows while the caterers prepped the reception area. Everything was running like clockwork. I was standing in the groom's preparation room, adjusting my tie one more time, when I decided to check my phone. I'd been avoiding it all morning because Sarah had made this big deal about not texting each other on the wedding day until we saw each other at the altar. But I had a work email I wanted to clear before the ceremony, and I figured one quick look wouldn't hurt. That's when I saw it. A text from Sarah sent about 20 minutes earlier. My stomach dropped as I read the words. She said she couldn't go through with the wedding. She said she was sorry, but she realized she didn't love me the way she should. She said she was leaving and that I should tell everyone the wedding was off. I read it 3 times before it actually sank in. My hands started shaking, and I had to sit down on the little couch in the room. Jake was talking to me about something, but I couldn't hear him over the ringing in my ears. This had to be some kind of mistake or joke, right? Who cancels their wedding by text message an hour before it starts? I tried calling her immediately, but it went straight to voicemail. I sent her a text asking what was going on, begging her to call me back. Nothing. Jake noticed something was wrong and kept asking what happened, but I couldn't even form words to explain it. Through the window, I could see guests starting to arrive. My aunts and uncles, Sarah's college friends, people who had traveled from out of state to be here. They were all dressed up and smiling, taking photos outside the venue. The photographer was setting up her equipment. The musicians were doing sound checks. Meanwhile, I'm sitting there holding this text message that just destroyed everything. Jake finally grabbed my phone to see what had me so messed up, and when he read it, his face went completely white. He started pacing around the room, asking if this was really happening and what we were supposed to do with all these people showing up. I knew I had to find Sarah and figure out what was going on. Maybe she was having a panic attack or cold feet, and we could work through it. I mean, you don't just cancel a wedding by text after 3 years together without some kind of explanation. There had to be more to this story. Jake and I made our way to the bridal suite on the other side of the venue. I could hear Sarah's bridesmaids talking and laughing inside, completely oblivious to what was happening. I knocked on the door and asked if I could speak to Sarah. Her maid of honor, Jessica, opened the door looking confused and told me Sarah wasn't there. Jessica said Sarah had left about 30 minutes ago, claiming she needed to run a quick errand and would be right back. The bridesmaids were starting to get worried because she wasn't answering her phone and the ceremony was supposed to start in less than an hour. I showed Jessica the text, and she just stared at it in complete shock. The bridesmaids started freaking out, calling Sarah's phone over and over. Jessica kept saying this couldn't be real, that Sarah had been excited all morning and talking about how perfect everything was going to be. But as the minutes ticked by and Sarah remained unreachable, reality started setting in for everyone. I was pacing around the bridal suite trying to figure out what to do when Sarah's cousin Emma pulled me aside. Emma had always been quiet and seemed uncomfortable whenever I was around, but I'd never thought much about it. Now she looked like she wanted to say something, but was scared to speak up. Emma asked if she could talk to me privately, and we stepped out into the hallway. She looked really nervous and kept glancing around like she was afraid someone would overhear us. Finally, she told me there was something I needed to know about Sarah, something that might explain what was happening. She said Sarah had been having doubts about the wedding for months, but not the kind of normal pre-wedding jitters everyone talks about. Emma said Sarah had confided in her that she wasn't sure she actually loved me, that she felt like she was just going through the motions because it seemed like the right thing to do at her age. But that wasn't the worst part. Emma hesitated for a long time before telling me that Sarah had been talking to her ex-boyfriend Marcus for the past few months. Not just casual conversation, but serious talks about getting back together. Emma said she'd urged Sarah to be honest with me, but Sarah kept saying she'd figure it out after the wedding. I felt like I'd been punched in the stomach. All those late nights when Sarah said she was working or out with friends, all the times she seemed distracted or distant, suddenly made sense. Emma looked miserable as she told me this, like she felt guilty for not saying something sooner. She pulled out her phone and showed me some screenshots of conversations she'd had with Sarah. I couldn't believe what I was reading. Sarah had been planning to go through with the wedding even though she knew she didn't love me, just because canceling would be too embarrassing and expensive. The only reason she'd finally backed out was because Marcus had told her he was moving across the country and this was her last chance to be with him. Emma and I found a quiet side room away from all the chaos where she could show me more of what Sarah had been telling her. My hands were still shaking as I scrolled through the screenshots on Emma's phone. I couldn't believe the person I'd been planning to marry had been living this double life right under my nose. The messages were brutal to read. Sarah had written to Emma about how she felt trapped and didn't know how to get out of the engagement without looking like the bad guy. She talked about how I was a good person but boring, and how she missed the excitement she'd felt with Marcus. There were messages from just 2 weeks ago where she was complaining about having to pretend to be happy during our final wedding preparations. Emma told me she'd been losing sleep over this for months, knowing what Sarah was doing but not knowing how to handle it. She said she'd tried to convince Sarah to either commit to the marriage or break up with me honestly, but Sarah kept saying she'd figure it out later. Emma felt terrible about not telling me sooner, but Sarah was her cousin and she didn't want to destroy the family. The worst part was reading about how Sarah and Marcus had been meeting up regularly over the past month. They'd been at hotels, at his apartment, making plans for their future together while I was busy finalizing seating charts and writing my wedding vows. Sarah had written to Emma that she felt like she was living a lie, but she was too scared of the confrontation and embarrassment to call off the wedding. Emma showed me a message from the night before where Sarah had finally decided she couldn't go through with it. Marcus had given her an ultimatum: come with him when he moved, or lose him forever. Sarah had chosen Marcus, but she was too much of a coward to tell me face to face. Hence the text message an hour before our ceremony. I was sitting there processing all of this when Emma's phone buzzed with a new message from Sarah. She was asking Emma to help explain things to everyone and to tell me she was sorry. She said she was already on her way to Marcus's place and wouldn't be coming back to deal with the aftermath. Emma looked at me with tears in her eyes and asked what I wanted to do. She offered to help me tell everyone that the wedding was canceled due to a family emergency or something vague like that. She said we could protect Sarah's reputation and just let people assume it was mutual or due to circumstances beyond our control. But as I sat there looking at all the evidence of Sarah's betrayal, something shifted inside me. I'd spent 3 years letting Sarah make all the decisions, going along with her plans, being the accommodating boyfriend and fiancé. I'd been ready to spend the rest of my life with someone who saw me as boring and safe, someone who was planning to settle for me while dreaming about someone else. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt completely clear about what I wanted to do. I wasn't going to protect Sarah's reputation or make this easy for her. She'd made her choice, and now she was going to live with the consequences. I asked Emma if she could help me get in touch with Sarah one more time. I needed to hear this from her directly before I decided how to handle the situation with all our guests. Emma tried calling Sarah's phone, and surprisingly, she actually answered this time. Emma put the call on speaker so I could hear. Sarah's voice sounded different, cold and distant in a way I'd never heard before. She asked Emma why she was calling and if everyone knew what was happening yet. When Emma told her I was there and wanted to talk to her, Sarah got quiet for a long moment. I took the phone and asked Sarah to explain what was going on. I told her I'd seen the text, but I needed to understand why she'd chosen to handle things this way. Sarah sighed like I was inconveniencing her by asking for an explanation. She said she thought the text was clear enough, and she didn't see what else there was to discuss. When I pressed her about Emma's revelations regarding Marcus, Sarah didn't even try to deny it. She said she'd been trying to figure out her feelings for months and had finally realized she couldn't marry me when she wasn't in love with me. She said it would have been unfair to both of us to go through with the wedding. I asked her why she couldn't have had this conversation with me weeks or months ago, before we'd invited 120 people and spent thousands of dollars on a wedding. Sarah got defensive and said she'd been confused and needed time to sort things out. She said she'd hoped her feelings for me would change, but they hadn't. The conversation that really got to me was when I asked her directly about Marcus. Sarah didn't show any shame or remorse about the affair. She said she and Marcus had reconnected as friends and realized they still had feelings for each other. She said it wasn't something she'd planned, but it had helped her understand what was missing in our relationship. She told me she was sorry for hurting me, but she said it in this flat, emotionless way that made it clear she wasn't actually sorry at all. She was sorry she'd gotten caught, sorry she had to deal with the mess, but not sorry for what she'd done. She said she hoped I'd understand someday that she'd done the right thing by not trapping us both in a loveless marriage. When I asked her what I was supposed to tell all the people who had traveled to be here today, Sarah said that was my problem to figure out. She said she'd already talked to her parents and they understood her decision. She suggested I just tell everyone the truth, that we'd realized we weren't right for each other. The call ended with Sarah saying she had to go because Marcus was waiting for her. She said she'd be in touch about getting her stuff from our apartment, and then she hung up. I stood there holding the phone, trying to process the fact that the woman I'd been planning to marry had just dismissed 3 years of our relationship like it meant nothing. Emma was crying by this point, apologizing over and over for not telling me sooner. But honestly, I was grateful she'd finally shown me the truth. Better to find out now than after we were married and I was legally tied to someone who saw me as a consolation prize. Jake found us in the side room and immediately knew something major had happened. The look on my face must have said it all. I filled him in on everything Emma had shown me and the conversation I'd just had with Sarah. Jake went through the same stages I had: disbelief, anger, then this grim understanding of how bad the situation really was. He started pacing around the room, running his hands through his hair and muttering about what a disaster this was. Jake kept asking what we were going to do with all the guests who were still arriving, the catered food that was being prepared, the photographer who was setting up equipment. The practical side of me was calculating how much money was going down the drain, but honestly, that seemed like the least important thing at that moment. Emma was still showing me more messages between her and Sarah, and each one made me angrier. There were complaints about my personality, about how I never surprised her or did anything spontaneous. There were detailed descriptions of her dates with Marcus and how alive he made her feel. Reading about my fiancé's affair while sitting in my wedding tux was surreal in the worst possible way. Jake suggested we just make a simple announcement that the wedding was canceled due to personal reasons and leave it at that. He said we could ask everyone to go home and we'd deal with the explanations later. But something about that approach felt wrong to me. Why should I protect Sarah's reputation when she'd just humiliated me in the worst way possible? I was still trying to decide what to do when my dad knocked on the door. He looked concerned and said the ceremony was supposed to start in 15 minutes, but no one could find the bride. He asked if everything was okay, and I realized I couldn't put off dealing with this anymore. I showed my dad the text message and watched his face change from confusion to anger. My dad has always been a calm, measured person, but I could see him struggling to process what Sarah had done. He asked if I'd talked to her, and I told him about the phone call and everything Emma had revealed. My dad sat down heavily in one of the chairs and shook his head. He said he'd never liked how Sarah had steamrolled over me during the wedding planning, but he'd figured that was just her personality and that I was okay with it. Now he was wondering if there had been other red flags he should have pointed out. Jake pulled me aside and said we needed to make a decision soon because people were getting restless. He said Sarah's parents were starting to panic because they couldn't reach her either, and the wedding coordinator was asking when we wanted to start the processional. That's when it hit me. Sarah's parents didn't know what she'd done. She'd told me they understood her decision, but clearly, she'd lied about that too. They were probably as blindsided as I was. I realized Sarah had left me to clean up her mess while she ran off to start her new life with Marcus. Jake could see I was getting worked up and tried to calm me down. He said the most important thing was getting through the next hour without making things worse. But I was tired of being the reasonable one, tired of accommodating everyone else's feelings while mine got trampled. For once in my life, I wanted to stop being so damn understanding. The wedding coordinator found us and said the guests were all seated and asking when the ceremony would begin. She looked stressed and kept checking her watch, clearly not understanding why everyone seemed so panicked. I realized we were at the point where we had to face the music and deal with this situation head-on. I walked out to the main hall and saw all 120 guests sitting in their chairs, dressed in their best clothes, holding programs with mine and Sarah's names on them. My grandparents had flown in from Florida. Sarah's college friends had driven up from 3 states away. Jake's parents had taken time off work. Everyone was there because they cared about us and wanted to celebrate what they thought was going to be the happiest day of our lives. My parents were standing near the front, looking worried but trying to keep smiles on their faces for the guests. Sarah's parents were by the bride's room, frantically making phone calls and looking increasingly panicked. The photographer was positioned to capture our first look at each other, and the musicians were ready to start the processional music. I stood at the front of the aisle in my tux, looking out at all these people who had no idea what was about to happen. Jake was beside me, quietly asking if I was sure I wanted to do this. Emma was in the back, still looking guilty but supportive. My dad gave me an encouraging nod from the front row. I asked the wedding coordinator if I could have the microphone for a moment. She looked confused but handed it over, probably thinking I wanted to make some kind of romantic speech before Sarah walked down the aisle. The room got quiet as everyone turned their attention to me. I started by thanking everyone for coming and for traveling to be with us on what was supposed to be our special day. I said I appreciated all the love and support they'd shown Sarah and me over the years. Then I took a deep breath and told them I had some difficult news to share. I pulled out my phone and read Sarah's text message word for word. The silence in the room was deafening. I could see people's faces changing from confusion to shock to anger as they processed what I was saying. Sarah's mom gasped and started crying. My mom covered her mouth with her hands. I explained that I'd tried to reach Sarah to understand what was happening, but she'd made it clear that her decision was final and she wouldn't be coming back. I said I was as shocked as everyone else, and I was sorry they'd all gotten dressed up and traveled here for nothing. The room erupted in whispers and murmurs as people tried to process what they'd just heard. Some of Sarah's relatives looked angry and started making phone calls, probably trying to reach her. My friends looked stunned and kept glancing at each other like they couldn't believe this was really happening. Sarah's dad stood up and demanded to know if this was some kind of joke. He said Sarah had seemed fine that morning and had been excited about the wedding. I told him I wished it was a joke, but I showed him the text on my phone and watched his face crumple as he realized his daughter had really done this. Sarah's mom stood up and started yelling at me, asking what I'd done to drive her daughter away. She said Sarah must have had a good reason for leaving and demanded to know what I'd done wrong. Other people were starting to take sides, with some of Sarah's family members nodding along and looking at me accusingly. I felt my face getting hot as people started questioning my character and wondering what I could have done to make Sarah run away on our wedding day. Jake stepped forward and told everyone to calm down, that this wasn't my fault and attacking me wasn't going to solve anything. But Sarah's aunt kept pushing, saying that women don't just abandon their weddings unless something terrible has happened. She suggested that maybe I'd been abusive or controlling, and that Sarah had finally found the courage to escape. Other people were murmuring agreement, and I could see the narrative shifting to make me the villain in this situation. That's when Emma stood up in the back of the room. She looked terrified but determined as she made her way to the front. She asked for the microphone and said there were things people needed to know before they started blaming me for what happened. Emma's hands were shaking as she told everyone about the conversations she'd had with Sarah over the past few months. She explained that Sarah had been having an affair with her ex-boyfriend Marcus and had been planning to leave me for him. The room went completely silent as Emma described how Sarah had been living a double life while I was planning our wedding. She pulled out her phone and started reading some of the messages Sarah had sent her. The room was so quiet you could hear a pin drop as Emma shared Sarah's complaints about me being boring, her descriptions of her dates with Marcus, and her admission that she was only staying with me because leaving would be too complicated. Sarah's family members who had been attacking me suddenly looked ashamed and stopped talking. My family and friends looked horrified as they realized what I'd been put through. The photographer had stopped taking pictures and was just standing there with her mouth open. Emma finished by reading the message Sarah had sent that morning, asking Emma to help clean up the mess she was leaving behind. She said Sarah was already with Marcus and had no intention of facing anyone or taking responsibility for what she'd done. Sarah's mom started crying harder and apologizing to me. She said she had no idea what her daughter had been doing and that she was ashamed of Sarah's behavior. Sarah's dad looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. My uncle stood up and started a slow clap, saying he was proud of me for handling the situation with dignity and for not protecting someone who didn't deserve it. Other people started clapping too, and I realized the room had completely shifted in my favor. Jake grabbed the microphone and suggested that since everyone was already here and the food was already prepared, we should turn this into a celebration of truth and friendship instead of letting Sarah's betrayal ruin the day for everyone. The aftermath was chaos in the strangest way possible. People were hugging me, apologizing for Sarah's behavior, and expressing disbelief that someone could be so cruel. The wedding coordinator looked completely lost, asking if we wanted to cancel the catering and send everyone home, but honestly, I wasn't ready for everyone to leave yet. Sarah's parents approached me separately to apologize for their daughter's actions and for initially blaming me. Her mom was still crying and kept saying she didn't raise Sarah to behave this way. Her dad offered to pay for the wedding expenses since Sarah had caused all this damage. I appreciated the gesture, but I told them it wasn't their fault and they didn't owe me anything. My friends were rallying around me, making sure I was okay and asking what they could do to help. Some of them were already talking about tracking down Sarah and Marcus to give them a piece of their minds, but I told them to let it go. Sarah had made her choice, and I didn't want to waste any more energy on someone who clearly didn't value what we'd had. The weird part was that I was starting to feel relieved instead of devastated. Yes, I was hurt and angry about the betrayal and the way she'd handled everything. But I was also realizing how miserable I would have been if we'd actually gone through with the marriage. Emma's revelations had shown me that Sarah had never really loved me the way I deserved to be loved. Jake suggested we move the reception forward and turn it into a party to celebrate my escape from a terrible marriage. At first, I thought it was a crazy idea, but the more I thought about it, the more it made sense. All these people had traveled to be here. The food was already paid for, and I was surrounded by everyone who actually cared about me. The photographer asked if she should pack up her equipment, but I told her to stay and document whatever this day was turning into. I figured someday I'd want to remember how everyone rallied around me when things fell apart. Some of Sarah's relatives left, clearly uncomfortable with the situation, but most people stayed. My college friends were already talking about turning this into the bachelor party I'd never had. My aunts were discussing how they'd never really liked Sarah anyway and had been worried about me marrying her. Emma came up to me and apologized again for not telling me sooner about Sarah's affair. I told her she'd actually saved me from making the biggest mistake of my life, even if the timing was awful. She looked relieved and said she'd been carrying around the guilt of keeping Sarah's secrets for months. The catering staff asked what they should do with all the food, and I told them to serve it. If people wanted to stay and eat, they were welcome to. If they wanted to leave, I understood. But I wasn't going to let Sarah's selfishness ruin what could still be a good day with people I cared about. As people started moving toward the reception area, I caught a glimpse of myself in one of the mirrors. I was still wearing my wedding tux, but instead of looking like a devastated groom, I looked like someone who had just dodged a bullet. What happened next was honestly one of the most surreal but amazing experiences of my life. Instead of a wedding reception, we ended up having this incredible celebration of friendship and family. People were toasting to my freedom, sharing stories about times they'd had doubts about Sarah, and generally turning what could have been the worst day of my life into something unexpectedly positive. My best man Jake gave a speech about how he'd never seen me happier than I looked right now, free from someone who didn't appreciate me. My dad talked about how proud he was of the way I'd handled the situation with grace and honesty. Even some of Sarah's relatives who stayed said they were ashamed of her behavior and glad I'd found out the truth before it was too late. The photographer ended up taking some of the best pictures of my life, me laughing with my friends, dancing with my mom, celebrating with people who actually cared about me. She said she'd never photographed a canceled wedding that turned into such a joyful event. Emma became the hero of the day for having the courage to speak up and show everyone the truth. People kept thanking her for protecting me from Sarah's deception, and I could see her guilt starting to lift as she realized she'd done the right thing. My college roommate made a toast about how he'd always thought Sarah was too controlling and how he was excited to see me date someone who would actually appreciate my sense of humor and kindness. Other friends chimed in with similar sentiments, and I realized that the people who knew me best had been worried about this marriage all along. The dance floor was packed with people celebrating my liberation. My grandmother, who's usually pretty reserved, told me she'd never liked Sarah and was thrilled I wouldn't be stuck with her. My cousin said Sarah had always seemed fake to her, and she was glad I'd found out who Sarah really was before signing any legal papers. As the evening went on, I found myself genuinely having fun for the first time in months. The stress and anxiety I'd been carrying around during the wedding planning was completely gone. I felt like myself again. The person I'd been before Sarah started reshaping me into her idea of the perfect husband. People started sharing contact information for single friends they wanted to introduce me to. And while I wasn't ready to think about dating yet, it felt good to know that people saw me as someone worth setting up. Sarah had made me feel boring and inadequate, but everyone else seemed to think I was quite a catch. By the end of the night, what had started as the worst betrayal of my life had turned into this incredible reminder of how many people loved and supported me. I realized that Sarah leaving was the best thing that could have happened, even if her timing and methods were cruel. Epilogue. That was 8 months ago, and honestly, my life has never been better. I moved out of the apartment Sarah and I shared and got a place downtown that's completely mine. I've been traveling, picked up some new hobbies, and reconnected with friends I'd lost touch with during my relationship with Sarah. I found out through mutual friends that Sarah and Marcus broke up about 3 months after she left me for him. Apparently, the excitement of their affair didn't translate into a sustainable relationship once they were actually together. She tried to reach out to me a few times, but I never responded. Emma told me Sarah was asking about me and seemed to regret her decision, but honestly, I don't care anymore. The whole experience taught me to trust my instincts and not settle for someone who doesn't genuinely love and appreciate me. I'm dating someone new now, a woman who thinks my accountant jokes are hilarious and actually enjoys spending time with me. It's amazing how different a relationship feels when both people are actually excited to be together. I still have the wedding photos from that day, the ones of me celebrating with my real friends and family. They remind me that sometimes the worst thing that can happen to you ends up being exactly what you needed. I dodged a massive bullet, and I'm grateful every day that Sarah was too much of a coward to fake her way through our wedding vows.